Welcome to Books and Looks, where we do a deep dive with authors to help you discover your next great read. Have you ever wondered about the dark side of the American dream? The secrets buried beneath layers of success? Or how frozen vegetables connect to national scandals and family betrayals? Well, you're in for a real treat today on Books and Looks. You see, we often see the shiny facade of successful families and businesses, but there's almost always a complex and often difficult story underneath. Unearthing these stories will help us understand not just history, but also the enduring themes of ambition, power, and family dynamics. Today, our guest is John Seabrook, who is the son and grandson of the men who built and lost one of America's most significant agricultural empires, Seabrook Farms. John has written an absolutely fascinating book about his family and their agricultural dynasty. A true rags to riches story until things went very, very wrong. I'm Blaine DeSantis. This is Books and Looks, and today we're talking with John Seabrook about his new book, The Spinach King, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty. John Seabrook, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thanks, Blaine. Good to be here.
Very happy to have you on, and I thought, extremely brave of you to write this book about your family, exposing all the good points, the bad points, and the ups and the downs. A very, very fine effort on your behalf. Very fine.
Thanks so much.
Well, and the thing is, your family doesn't go back that far because I think it began in America. I think it was your great grandfather was the first person who came over here,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and
My great-grandfather.
right, and it's like a rags to riches story, truly rags to riches story, and yet your grandfather's basically eliminated from history. Why did your grandfather do that to his father?
Yeah. So my great-grandfather, who was named Arthur P. Seabrook, came over to the U.S. from London with his father and mother in 1859. And they were just kind of displaced working class people looking for a better opportunity. They found their way down to southern New Jersey, the very southern part of New Jersey, which a lot of people don't even know exists. And there's really very little reason to go there. It's like that peninsula, not the Cape May side, but the other side. They found their way down there. It's always been a great farming area. In the 19th century, a lot of the vegetables that went to Philadelphia and New York came from New Jersey. They were called truck farmers, and that wasn't because they used trucks. It's because the word truck was used for produce. It was like I have no truck with you would be a way of using that word. And his so my great-grandfather learned the truck farming business as an apprentice, starting at the age of 15. He eventually made enough money to buy his own land, in the 1880s, and then he and his son, my grandfather Charles, went into the farming business together in 1905. But my grandfather never liked farming. He never liked the whole hard work and outdoor part of farming. He liked making money and business and building is what he wanted to do. And he's originally thought he would just leave the farm as soon as possible. But because they lived in that first decade of the 20th century when farms were mechanizing, he realized that instead of leaving the farm for industry, he could bring industry to the farm. And that's what his inspiration was Henry Ford, who was about 20 years older than him. And his vision was to build a Fordist vegetable factory in southern New Jersey and to use those kind of mass production methods and apply them to vegetables, both growing of vegetables and then the processing of vegetables. And so that's basically, he found some investors in New York. They backed him. He bought his father's share of the land for much less than the land was worth. So he sort of cheated his father out of it. And that is important later on. And then he built this vegetable factory in the 19 teens During the First World War, it went very well because the food price of food went through the roof. But after the war, the food prices collapsed, and he eventually went bankrupt. And that was the first iteration of Seabrook Farms. But he came back the second time, and for good, with frozen vegetables. He knew Clarence Birdseye. Clarence Birdseye was a inventor who, invented the flash freezing process. He was inspired by seeing fish caught above the Arctic Circle freeze in midair, and then when warmed up months later, it tasted just as good as if they'd just been caught, and he thought, "If I could reproduce that in the laboratory, I could patent it, and that would be a food revolution." And he did, and he did it for fish and poultry, but vegetables kind of eluded him. Vegetables were a little harder to figure out. You have to cook them a little bit first. And my grandfather and he worked on it together. At this point, my grandfather had his three sons, the youngest of which was my father, and they kind of worked out this process. And so they became the frozen vegetable packers for Birdseye and really pioneers in the whole, industry of frozen food. And then after the war, Second World War, they started their own brand, Seabrook Farms, and that became a by their peak in the 50s. So yeah, you talk about rags to riches. They went from well, he went from a share my great-grandfather was a sharecropper who eventually had a 50-acre farm to by 1955, my grandfather, and his sons had 25,000 acres and another 25,000 acres under contract. They had 8,000 employees. There was a whole village, called Seabrook, which is still there, created for the workers. They froze a third of the nation's frozen vegetables. They basically introduced the lima bean to the East Coast, which the lima bean turned out to be a great vegetable to freeze. Um, they brought people from all around the world really to Southern New Jersey as workers who ended up settling there, including Japanese Americans from internment camps during World War II, Estonians from displaced persons camps after the war, African Americans from the Jim Crow South. Seabrook, New Jersey, even though it's in the middle of really nowhere, became a nexus, a kind of a not a melting pot, but a crossroads for many different cultures because the nature of farm work is such that Americans didn't really wanna do it, and so they had to find people from other places to do it, and that's certainly still true, as we know, and anyway, so yeah, it became that's the riches. It got
Yeah,
that
it
big.
certainly was. But now your great-grandfather comes from, England, but there's another branch of the Seabrooks, also from England, that your grandfather wanted to be associated with. Why? And that's why I guess he eliminated your great-grandfather from his history. What tell us about that.
Yeah, so my grandfather, was a man who wasn't educated beyond 8th grade, but who achieved great success and rose very quickly from being a sort of working class to upper class, kinda skipped the middle class pretty much altogether, and, he felt that he needed more illustrious ancestors. I think like a lot of Americans who find themselves, very rich or successful, all of a sudden, it's hard for them to sort of figure out who they are, what their identity is. And for my grandfather, he felt like in order to sort of make sense of his life, his success, he needed to have more illustrious ancestors than he had. And so he basically, there was another branch of Seabrooks who came to America much earlier than us, who settled in South Carolina. As anyone in South Carolina knows, there's a Seabrook Island just off of kind of, the coast of South Carolina, the Edisto Island. That's where they settled. They had a big plantation of, and lots of slaves, and that was the family my grandfather wanted to belong to. But in order for that to happen, he first of all had to hire a genealogist to prove it or make it up or link us, and then he had to get rid of his actual ancestors. So, yeah, he made when the brand started, and the thing about the Seabrook brand was that it was unlike Birdseye or Green Giant, which another frozen food power. It was based on a real family, my family, and the family was used as a promotional, strategy to sell the product. And so when they came to write the brand story, the story of the Seabrook family, my father and his brothers were startled to discover that their father wanted to completely eliminate his father from the brand story, the brand history, the history of the company, even though his father, I mean, and then to make CF into kind of a self-made man, but really his father was the one who really mastered the art of growing vegetables. CF mastered a lot of other things, logistics, building, finance, but the actual, art of growing vegetables was what his father did very well and taught CF, and also irrigation, which the Seabrooks introduced a lot of different innovations over the decades of the 20th century, but the first one in the first decade, in 1906 or so, was irrigation. South Jersey had no irrigation. The farmers who grew there had to depend on the weather, and if it didn't rain, they were screwed. And because if you didn't have pumps and if the ground was completely flat, you couldn't move water anywhere with any kind of effectiveness and economic, reality. But so the Seabrooks brought pumps to that area for the first time and created an irrigation system that then spread to the other farms. And that was CF's father's idea. So anyway, so he kind of erased his father from company history and replaced him with this illustrious family that went back to the 17th century.
Who didn't know
Yeah.
the other side of the family over in England, if I'm not mistaken.
I discovered that we had all these cousins over there, when I started researching this book, because by then you had the internet, and I was able to find, on Facebook, I think, a Colin Seabrook who lives in Essex, which is where I kind of knew my family sort of came from. And, I met him over there, and he had a whole family tree going back, into the mid-18th century of Seabrooks. And then he had, like, a question mark for my great-grandfather, what happened to him? So I was like, "Oh, well, I can tell you what happened to him. It's my family."
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. That's really great. So I got a little bit of genealogy as you were finding this out, and that can be
Genealogy
a
is
lot of
fun. It's
it
great. It's
can
a
be,
fun thing
yes,
to
yeah.
do.
Especially when it pops up the wrong people
I
that you
and
weren't
and it
expecting.
usually does one way or another, right?
I know that wasn't that show on PBS or something like that about,
Right.
gentleman has that? Yeah, and you'd see who your genealogies are. Anyway, this whole book, which is, by the way, friends, this is a fantastic book, okay? If you can't tell it, I'm loving this book. This book grew out of a speech that you had to write for your dad, your grandfather, right?
My
Or
dad
your
was
dad,
writing
your
it for
dad,
my
right, right,
grandfather.
yeah, you were writing it for your dad. You
And he helped me. Yeah, so the little background of that is, one of the worker groups and one of the most devoted worker groups that came to Seabrook during those years was the Japanese Americans who came from, as a lot of folks know, in 1942 after Pearl Harbor. FDR issued Executive Order 9066, which basically allowed the government to round up American citizens who happened to be of Japanese American descent in the West Coast area and place them in internment camps all around the country. And then, as soon as they had done that, I think they realized how horrific an act, this violation of civil liberties this was. And so they wanted to move those workers to farms and industries around America, but off the West Coast. And Seabrook Farms was one of the places that workers ended up going. Seabrook recruited from the camps. Some of the workers who came to Seabrook went back and recruited from the camps. And eventually, 2,000 of those workers and their families came during the war years, settled at Seabrook, worked in the plant. A lot of them went back to California, but some of them stayed, and they started a museum, which is there still and open still, which was devoted to the history of the company and my grandfather and their experience in coming to Seabrook during these very traumatic years in their lives. And so there was my father was asked to speak at the opening of that museum in 1994, and at a reunion at the same time, a reunion of a lot of the workers and their families. At this point, a lot of them, their children or adults. Yeah, and he asked me to. Well, I was struck by the fact my father was a very gifted man in many ways, and one of the ways was public speaking. He was very glib and he never seemed to have any fear of public speaking or blocks in terms of the flow of words. But in this particular occasion, he he seemed to, and the subject was, what were the qualities of your father that allowed him to create this enterprise, Seabrook Farms? And he seemed to really be struggling with it, and I was sort of interested in that. And he then asked me to help him. At this point, I had started my career. I've been a staff writer at the New Yorker for almost 30 years now, but that was like the one at the very beginning. And so I was, sort of happy to try to help him. And I realized as I was working with him and looking at the materials that there was a lot more to this story of my grandfather as this kind of benevolent humanitarian capitalist, that the story that's told in the museum, than we knew, that there was a darker side to it, and that he knew what it was, and he had experienced it, but for some reason, he couldn't talk about it, and, um, and it really had blocked him from being able to write this speech. And so, that was really the beginning of this project in a way, because, I had grown up with this idea of my family's history in Seabrook Farms as being, one of great innovators and engineers, and they were in many ways, and we can talk about some of those ways. But the fact is that the whole business fell apart in 1959. It was sold. My my father and his brothers were disowned. There was some huge explosion that had happened between my father and his father, and it had resulted in the end of the company. And what had happened, and he wasn't saying, he never said what happened. And the only thing in the speech that he said that came close was that it was striking that my grandfather had such a close relationship with his workers and such a distant and cold relationship with his family. But he didn't go too much further than that. And my project really became to figure out, what really happened between
Yeah.
them.
And friends, I've done a lot of reading, and as many of our listeners have, of what went on in the or internment camps, excuse me, the internment camps out west.
Some people call
I
them
ne-
concentration camps.
I never knew, John, that they had been basically leased out, farmed out to other produce companies. That was news to me when I read that. And so, did they contact your dad, or how did your grandfather get around to getting these people here?
That's a good question, Blaine. Yeah, it was in my father and grandfather's case, it was the American Society of Friends, the Quaker organization, specifically their Philadelphia branch. The Quaker, the Society of Friends had been one of the very most prominent civil rights groups that protested the internment of Japanese Americans from the very beginning. It was quite, you have to remember, this is right after Pearl Harbor. There was this hysteria, and there was, the reason for it was that a lot of people feared that Japanese Americans would, because of their ethnic origin, would be more inclined to side with the enemy. and that they had to be taken away from the West Coast to protect, our country, which was absolutely racist, completely. And in fact, these folks were some of the most patriotic people around, and for them, coming to Seabrook, even though, like, in terms of living conditions, it really wasn't much of an upgrade, the same kind of barracks type. Plus, they now have to work, which in the internment camps they didn't, and they're paying rent now, because my grandfather not only owned the company, he also owned all the housing, and he was their landlord. He had absolute control. And so even in spite of those things, they wanted to be at Seabrook because they could prove their patriotism. Food was very much connected to the war effort. All of Seabrook's Everything Seabrook grew during the war years was sold to the government. The government asked Seabrook to plant beets and rutabagas because they could be dehydrated and put into meals ready to eat for soldiers in any climate, and they had a lot of iron in them and other nutrients, and everything they grew, the quartermaster bought. So, and the Japanese workers were, producing that food. So it made them feel a lot less ashamed, I think, than they had in these camps. And they saw my grandfather as being a person who had allowed them that opportunity. And they really, well, more than respected him for it, really venerated him for it. And then the same with so after the war, there were a lot of people who came from the Baltics and other Eastern European countries that ended up in displaced persons camps. Also, a lot of the survivors of the Holocaust ended up there too. And for some years, no one really knew what to do with them. Who wanted them? In the case of the Baltics, the Estonians, they couldn't go back to their homeland because the Soviet Union had taken it over, and they were hostile to them. So my grandfather sponsored 700 to 900 of them, and they came to Seabrook and became American citizens and found, a pathway to America and whatever success they could find. And they very much venerate my grandfather too. So that was in writing the story. It wasn't just like I was taking a story that had never been written and telling the story. I was taking a story that an official version of which, like a company PR version of which, had been written and even enshrined in a museum. And I was kind of presenting an alternate version of that narrative, which kind of undercut that narrative and that man in significant ways. That was one of the big challenges of this project.
Absolutely. And, people don't realize, you mentioned the Estonians. When the war started, they were basically under, not dominate, but they could say domination of the Germans.
Yeah,
Then
they
here
spoke
came the
German.
Russians in. Right. Then here
Yeah.
come the Russians in. They're there a year. Then the Germans come back in again, and it goes back and forth, swinging back and forth. And it's a fascinating history of the Estonians during World War II. But they ended up, a bunch of them here in America. That's really something. Well, let's go to a dark. And I don't want to sit there and talk long about this, but it's a dark area. 1934. You have the strikes. You've got the race riots. You got the KKK. You got armed vigilantes. Tell us about what happened there, John.
Yeah, so we haven't talked a lot about labor, but a significant so my grandfather really sold Seabrook to investors as a mechanized Fordist, modern operation. But in fact, mechanization couldn't really cover all aspects of the vegetable growing and production line. When it came to grains and corn and wheat, yeah, you could mechanize that whole operation and do it all with a couple machines. But when it came to picking and cultivating vegetables, there were still steps in the operation that needed people. And so, even as the company continued to mechanize, the labor force continued to grow. And even when you could get, like, big machines like viners that could hoover up a whole row of beans and vines and all, and then you had to have people on the other end of the line sorting everything in the plant. So anyway, so labor was always an issue. In the early 20th century, there was a lot of Southern Italian immigration, Eastern European immigration, and my grandfather benefited from those workers. But that dried up in the 20s when there was this kind of nativist backlash to immigration, not unlike the one we're getting today. And those workers were replaced by African Americans who were coming, in the part of the Great Migration coming out of the South, and they worked at Seabrook Farms in the 30s as the company was beginning to get into frozen vegetables. But the black workers were never treated as, fairly. The white workers always, even though the black workers had seniority, they would always be the first to be let go during the slack season when they didn't need as many workers, and then rehired when they did. So eventually they decided to form a union and call a strike, and they did in July of 1934. And that was a very courageous act, not only because South Jersey was a kind of a Jim Crow de facto place in those days and after for many years, but also because my grandfather was a man of total control who never had been challenged by anybody, his sons or anybody. And so to have black workers challenge his authority was particularly galling. And he brought in these armed vigilantes, many of 'em small-time farmers, Italian, the sons of the original workers in some cases. The KKK in the East Coast had a kind of resurgence in the 20s and 30s, part of that nativist backlash against immigration. And there was a chapter in South Jersey that offered their help. They weren't actually involved in the violence, but they were kind of hovering in the background, and they burned crosses on the lawns of some of the officers of this union. Eventually, the FDR, as Secretary of Labor, sent a negotiator to settle the strike, and an agreement was hammered out in which those black workers would be rehired at a higher wage and promised not to be let go during the slack season, etc. But it's basically as soon as the negotiators left, my grandfather went back on it and fired them all. And really that was some black workers continued to work at the company, but that was the beginning of the turn to the Japanese Americans and then the Estonian workers. And in the history of the strike and the history of the black workforce really was really erased from company history, never featured in that early iteration of the museum. And I didn't even know about the story of the strike until, I started researching Seabrook Farms. After my father's speech, I decided to look further into it. And that was one of the very first things that I discovered was that there had been this strike at Seabrook, and my family had been involved. And my father's oldest brother, Belford, was described as throwing a tear gas bomb into a woman's house with children. And my other uncle, Courtney, was the middle brother, was arrested for running over one of the strikers with a truck. And these men were nice, gentle men. My father's older brothers, always very sweet. So, this was pretty shocking stuff. That kind of stuff, it's really when you're a writer who's writing about your family and then you discover these things that your family has done that are very unpleasant, it does pose a very difficult dilemma for you, which is whether it's better to protect your family or whether, as a writer, this is good material.
That's why I said you're a brave man to do this. A lot of people wouldn't do that because there's some bad parts in all families, and you got to write about that. Hey, one of the things I want to talk to you about, there's so much to talk about, John. 2001: A Space Odyssey. There is Seabrook Farms frozen spinach in this classic American movie. How did that come all about?
Yeah, so if you watch 2001 and, you have your clicker ready, when it gets to the scene, where the astronauts, they find this thing on the moon, the tablet thing has shown up, and they're bringing a couple of people over from Earth, and there's a scene of transiting, and they have a meal in the space station, and they're seen sort of squeezing this kind of stuff into these straws and then kind of sucking on it, and if you look at the packaging, it's their Seabrook Farms logo is right at the bottom, and it's like liquefied vegetables, liquefied carrots, and so it's and so the question is like, what is did they get permission? And, yes, they did. It was licensed. I guess that at that point, the company had been sold to another firm. That was after the '59 split, and so I didn't see the records of, like, what those negotiations were like, but I do know that the brand was definitely, behind that, and saw that as a, favorable, marketing opportunity. I don't think that's the way Kubrick meant it. I think the film sort of makes it sort of horrifying to have to eat this stuff, and it is kind of funny because it really like, I mean, it's not inconsistent with the way frozen food was marketed in the '50s when Seabrook really was innovating, and Seabrook was one of the first to introduce the boil in a bag pouch, which the Kubrick thing was kind of a play on, and that was, actually a big innovation because, that allows you to prepare recipes, not just frizz spinach, but cream spinach. You add butter and cream and even like whole entrees you could put in the bag before you froze them. And that allowed that was just a very sort of modern space age kind of a thing, and that's how they sold the product. And they and the advertising was all kinda like Jetsons, sort of like the modern couple, they're dressed to go out to the opera and she's just and the kitchen is super modern and clean, and it's but it's very sort of sterile, and I think that's what Kubrick was kind of, satirizing
Well,
really in
that's pretty
2001.
neat. That's pretty neat. There is so much we can get into here. I mean, all your family's innovations. One of the things, so you grew up with a known gangster in the house as a bodyguard, Red Saunders. Tell us what that was all about.
Yeah, it was my dad, really, yeah, well, so after the strike, or actually leading up to the strike, um, and this so we're talking the 1930s, the American Communist Party was quite an active entity. Communism really, it was a lot of liberals in the late 20s and early 30s had kind of embraced the Communist Party. We didn't really know that much. Stalin's programs were just starting. The information was slow getting out, and a lot of liberals were very infatuated with communism and the labor unions, and the whole union movement was kind of deeply entwined with the American Communist Party, which later became the subject of the McCarthy hearings. But so in the early mid '30s, some of the people who came down to Seabrook to support the black workers and then to organize them were affiliated with the American Communist Party, and some of them were, they were arsonists. They made their own, wooden baskets down there, and the storehouse where they held those was set on fire one night, and, other houses were burned, and there was threats of violence. So my grandfather, who at this point was living with my grandmother and my father, who was at that point 16, 17 years old, in their big house in the middle of the fields of South Jersey, which it's a fairly isolated place. Decided they needed a bodyguard in the house, and they hired this guy from Atlantic City named Red Saunders, who Prohibition had just ended in 1933, and Red Saunders had been a bootlegger, and he was out of he was out of work, and a lot of those bootleggers actually some of them, the sort of gangster elements ended up being strike breakers, and that's how he, was kinda making a living at that point was as a strike breaker, as like an enforcer who you could bring in and beat the workers up, and maybe that's how my grandfather heard about it. My grandfather had various dealings in Atlantic City. Atlantic City was not that far from Seabrook, and, during the legend is that during Prohibition, he would, make apple brandy from his apple crop and take it to Atlantic City and sell it, but I'm not sure if that's really true. At any rate, um, yeah, he needed protection. He hired this guy, Red Saunders, and he moved into the house, and my father and he became, my father was really always looking for a father figure because even though he had this immensely powerful, magnificent father, he never really got to spend much time with him. He was never around a lot. He was always insanely busy and often away. And that's kind of one of the sort of poignant things about my dad's life is that he was always searching for like an older man who could be kind of closer to him. And so Red Saunders became one of those men. It was sort of an unlikely pairing. They didn't really have a lot in common, but Red Saunders and he wrote letters to each other when he went away to this kind of one-year boarding school and then to Princeton. And he kept those letters along with a lot of his other things that he left for me. And so I got to kind of have an intimate look at my father's relationship with the in-house gangster.
My word. Hey, well, I gotta move forward to your dad. Your dad was accompanying Grace Kelly and part of her entourage when she went to Monaco to marry Prince Rainier. How'd that come about?
Yeah, so my dad was married when he was very young, to, a woman who was even younger. They eloped, actually, and, it was not a match made to last, although we had 2 children, my half sisters. And then he got divorced, and then in the '50s, he was a swinging bachelor. He was a very impressive-looking guy. He was tall and handsome, and he was absolutely beautifully dressed. Always his I write about his clothes in the book quite a bit. He had such an extensive closet that he actually had a mechanical, like a dry cleaner's apparatus installed in the attic of the house that then kinda came down behind the walls, and so that when you stood in front of his dressing room closet, it was like a normal closet, but then there was this keypad and then a code with the numbers that corresponded to different kinds of clothes, and you'd push that in, and the whole thing would move around. I mean, it was he was incredible. At any rate, he was a very attractive, young guy in the '30s, and he dated a lot of movie stars, including Ava Gabor, who was the sister of Zsa Zsa, and, like say in the book, they were sort of like the Kardashians before the Kardashians, the 3 Gabor sisters, and, she would come to the farm. In fact, a lot of people who probably know Ava Gabor through Green Acres may be surprised to learn that the role she played in Green Acres, which was that of a sophisticated city cosmopolitan who comes down to live on a farm, she lived, 10 years before that role when she dated my dad and would come down to Seabrook Farms. The Kellys were also part of his social orbit because Grace Kelly's father, Jack Kelly, was a builder, in Philadelphia. Like my family, the Kellys started out, sort of working class. They were immigrant bricklayers. And famously, Jack Kelly, as a young man, was not allowed to row in the Henley Regatta in England, because he was a so-called bricklayer, and the rules forbid having tradesmen because the young aristocrats who can it wasn't fair. That in 1918, he won the Olympics, he won the gold medal and sent his cap to the king and said, "From a bricklayer," and that kinda made him like a national hero. And anyway, so, his company built the Seabrook, power plant, this and very impressive brick smokestack that rose 200 feet in the air with the word Seabrook on it, was built by Jack Kelly. So the Kellys and the Seabrooks knew each other, and Grace and my dad knew each other, but like, she was quite a bit younger. And when Grace Kelly decided to get married, she invited my dad not only to the wedding, but to ride across the ocean on this ocean liner that the Kelly family chartered, like, like the whole thing, the SS Constitution, to take the wedding party and the press from New York to Monte Carlo for the wedding. Meanwhile, my mother, who my father has yet to meet, is a reporter, and then she started out in South Dakota, Spearfish, South Dakota, a small town. Her grandfather had been a pioneer, homesteaded that place in the 1870s, and she went to Missouri Journalism School, during the war years, and then she got these opportunities that, were available to women during the war years when the men were away to work, and she started out in Kansas City, transferred to Washington, and then she was quickly moved to New York where her talent, was apparent, and she worked for the United Press and became a columnist, in the early mid '50s, writing about it was called Women's World. It was sort of, there were a lot of, movie stars, but not just that, social movers and shakers, different kinds of women, and she had broken the news of Grace Kelly's engagement in her column, and that was a big scoop, and Grace had maybe given it to her because they knew each other, and they were both kinda Irish Catholic girls and living in New York. Anyway, so my mother got invited along on the ship sailing from New York, with the Kelly family as a member of the press, and there were a lot of press on that ship. The Kellys were very interested in publicity, and my father and my mother met on the ship. There were, like, cocktail parties and stuff. There are these wonderful pictures, which some of them are in the book, of my mother on the ship with the reporters and Grace Kelly. And then when they got to Monte Carlo, uh, the Rainier family were not into publicity because they were like the royals, they didn't believe in talking to reporters. Kellys love publicity. And so there were no scheduled events for the press. And, there were all these reporters there because it was like, the story of the year, really. And, but my father heard this one great story. At that time, a year before the movie To Catch a Thief was in movie theaters. That's the Cary Grant and Grace Kelly movie, in which Cary Grant plays a cat burglar in the south of France. And it turns out there was a real life cat burglar at the wedding, and, one of the guests, Jewel from Philadelphia's jewels had been stolen, and, the palace wanted to keep it all hushed up, and my father heard about it, took my mother out to lunch and said, "If you don't tell anyone, they're interviewing the woman right now, you can go and get an exclusive," and she was like, "Oh, I won't tell anyone," and she came with him, and she got this exclusive story, which you can imagine it was really the story of the wedding, and it was sensational, and that, I think, gave my father a leg up with my mother, and, they were married, 5 months after the Kelly Rainier wedding, and it was always kind of linked in their that story and my how they met because they met really because of, Grace and Grace Kelly's marrying the prince and all of that. That great American story, fairy tale was entwined with my parents' kind of fairy tale, and those are the kind of stories that made me a writer, I think, because my father was a great storyteller. He would tell that story, and I heard it, a number of times. He would tell it to different people who came to the house, and he always had a great way of telling a story. And even though I think I have my mother, I do what my mother does. At journalism, and I think partly the reason I do it is because, well, my mother stopped doing it when she met my dad, and I always feel like she sort of maybe certainly regretted that, and I think I sort of maybe sort of fulfilled some of her unfulfilled, ambitions, I don't know how that works, but I think that works in families, so I value my mother's actual career and her maybe and her perspective on my family, but it was my father's storytelling, I think, that really kind of made me the kind of journalist I am, which is a very sort of narrative-driven New Yorker sort of storytelling journalist.
Well, one
Yeah.
story we gotta talk about, and again, I have a lot more I could ask, but your dad was I think a four-in-hand coachman, is that the terminology? Tell us about your dad, coaches, and carriages, and what's that all about?
Yeah, Blaine, man, I've been trying to explain this my whole life. Let me tell you. When I say the word coaching, most people don't think of four in hand, four horses in one hand with a top hat. They think of like the football field, standing on the sidelines. But that's not the kind of coaching my dad did. He never coached me in that way, in any way. He didn't play sports or care about sports. In fact, the only kind of uh, like recreational activity, outside of work which wasn't it was four-in-hand driving, and so that is, what they if you look at Dickens, if you read Dickens or look at photographs, or I mean, paintings, 19th century, you see, like, the big carriage and the four horses and the people sitting on top, and then inside, there's room for more, and, those were really the buses of the 18th century, 19th century. In fact, if you go to England, they still call their buses coaches, for that reason, and so my father started collecting those things, and he had the prize of his collection was this coach called the Nimrod, which had made a run between London and Oxford in late 19th century. And Nimrod was in the Bible. He in Genesis, Nimrod shows up and is a he's a mighty hunter who became mighty in the earth, is how he's described. And my father, for reasons that always sort of eluded me until I finally realized it was really his father that was the explanation. My father formed this kind of bond with Nimrod and had all the license plates on in his vehicles changed to Nimrod 1, 2, and 3. Had the name of the road changed to Nimrod Road. But unfortunately, while he was doing this, the word Nimrod was no longer a mighty hunter. He was more like a mighty doofus. And the reason for that was the Bugs Bunny had called Elmer Fudd Nimrod in the cartoons because Nimrod was such a terrible hunter. As you remember, he was like, he couldn't see and he never got Bugs Bunny, so he was mocking him by calling him Nimrod, and I think it was Gen X sort of picked up on that, and it made it so that if you went for a ride in one of the Nimrod cars by the, '80s, you got a lot of honking and flashing lights from, a lot of hysterical, people that my father completely ignored. At any rate, so he had this four-in-hand coaching setup, and it required, first of all, a huge amount of mastery. I mean, that was one thing that, like, I'll give him his props for. doing this, the physical act of driving 4 horses with 8 different reins, all looped around different fingers, and, 4 powerful horses with 12 people sitting up about 15 feet above the ground. If you don't know what you're doing, you can get really seriously hurt. And so there was that part of it, but then there was all the right harness, the right presentation, the right horses. And as he went on, and this a lot of this happened after he was disowned by his father. As he went on, he became increasingly elaborate, increasingly royal, really. The only other people that really kind of do this at that scale are royal people, who have, like the palace to pay for it. And so where was the money coming from? How did he make that money? That becomes part of the book. And that was another kind of dark part of the story. But yeah, I grew up that was what we did as a family. We went out on the coach, and there were times when it was fun. Like, we would go for a picnic in the woods, and we would take one of the lesser showy coaches, and tie the horses up by the trees and cook out, and that was a lot of fun. Also a lot of drinking later on those kind of excursions. But the ostentatious display, which was important to my dad, I always, recoiled from it. I was embarrassed when we went along these little country roads with my dad in his top hat, and people would, like, pull their cars over and take pictures as though we were, like, Princess Diana and Prince Charles
Yeah.
or something. I hated that stuff. I never wanted that kind of exposure.
Well, anyway, it is a fascinating life. Like I said, before we even started this interview, I could talk for hours for you because you are fascinating. The story is fascinating. We only got to around half of the questions we're going to talk about, but you know what? You're going to have to read it, friends, in the book because this is one great book. And these are just some of the stories that you're going to find in this book and this history of the family. Truly a rags to riches story, back to rags. And again, I don't know. They got the business has been sold. By the way, did any of the family still own any part of the business or
Yeah.
anything? Okay.
Yeah, Blaine. So what happened was, yeah, so there was this whole blow up, after my grandfather died in 1964. And so and as I said, his will, like, cut his sons out. He left a lot of his money to the only daughter because see, what happened to precipitate that was, he got crazier in the '50s. He started doing a lot of irrational stuff. The bankers on the board of directors basically said, "This guy's nuts. You gotta get rid of him, or we're gonna call our loans, and the company will be bankrupt." And so the sons decided that the only way they could remove him was to have him declared incompetent and to basically have him confined. And they tried to do that, but their sister didn't support it, and it failed. And their father found out about it, and he disowned them, changed his will. But after he died, there were all these. They tried to have the will thrown out. He did a bunch of interviews with people, and my father kept all that material and left it for me after he died. And that was the first time I really knew exactly how my father had been treated by his father. And it seemed like he was like using me as an instrument of revenge, really, to get back at his father, after after death, really. And I kind of struggled with whether I wanted to be the instrument of his revenge. At any rate, so the land, was eventually sold. My grandfather's land was eventually sold. The government took over a lot of the housing, but my father's oldest brother's sons, so my father's oldest brother was Belford. His sons started a new frozen food company, packing company in that area in the '80s, and they eventually bought back the brand, the Seabrook Farms brand, and they packed that brand. So the original company is gone, and the buildings are mostly gone except for that museum, which I encourage people who are in that area to visit. But the new plant is working nearby. Now the next generation runs it, but my cousins, and they pack the brand and they pack the frozen cream spinach is still popular in markets where it's available, and it actually is really pretty good, I gotta admit. And so, yeah, there's still a family component. I'm not sure they're too pleased with me for writing this book, because I think they prefer the official narrative of my grandfather. But hopefully we'll reconcile that
There you
somehow.
go. All right. Well, I tell you what, I can't take up any more of your time. We've gone on for almost an hour. My God, we can talk. Having a great time with you, John. Very good. I want to just say, on behalf of all of us here at Books and Looks, thank you, John Seabrook, for being with us today on Books and Looks.
This has been really fun, Blaine. Thank you.
Well, once again, John, thank you for this truly fascinating look at your family at Seabrook Farms. Friends, history is all around us, and behind many successes, there lie layers of complexity, secrets, and human costs. Last year we had an episode on the Sugar King, and now we highlight the Spinach King. And the one constant in both books are the family struggles and quarrels that lead to the breakdown of the family, as well as the loss of a family business. And so another episode of Books and Looks is now in the books. On behalf of our partners at bookstrib.com, this is Blaine DeSantis wishing you another week of happy reading. We'll be back next week with another edition of Books and Looks.